The next speaker I'd like to invite up onto the stage is Steve Yeong from the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research.
You'll just have to give me a second to get set up here. Alrighty, let's get going. So my name's Steve. Today I'm going to be presenting some preliminary results from a study I'm doing on the effect of delayed school entry on crime. So what do we know about it so far? We know that from more than 3 decades of empirical research that education has a desirable effect on just about every outcome of interest in the social sciences. We know, for example, that higher levels of education increase lifetime earnings, civic engagement, cognitive skills in old age, and even longevity more generally. So what about crime? When we look at the research that looks at the effect of education on crime, there are kind of 2 broad sort of subfields. The first is about the effect of delayed school entry. So this is how old you are when you enter school. This is about school entry laws. The second is about raising the minimum school leaving age. This is about how old you are when you can leave school, so school exit laws. The broader paper I'm working on involves kind of like looking at both effects and comparing them, but today we're just going to be talking about delayed school entry. So what's the kind of general idea here? Within a given grade cohort, so people in like say kindergarten in 2010 or something like that, school entry laws generally result in some share of students being older than others. Now, it all starts when you enter school, so that's kindergarten in New South Wales. In New South Wales, you can enter kindergarten when you turn 5 or when you turn 6. As a result of when you enter, if you enter when you turn 5, you're going to be 14 in grade 9, and you're going to be 17 by the time you're finishing in grade 12. So if you think back to schoolies, they're the kids that had to have fake IDs. If you enter when you turn 6, you turn 15 in grade 9, and then you're 18 in grade 12, so you're buying booze for your friends. There's this kind of question, if you have this 1-year age gap between students in the same grade, are older students going to do better academically, for example, because they're more mature? In general, we know this is true, at least in the short term. If you have delayed school entry and you enter school later, you get better test scores, although there is this catching up effect in the long term. But if you do get better test scores and presumably are better educated as you progress through school, at least for some period of time, are you going to be less prone to crime? You might be less prone to crime because you have higher levels of human capital. So in a nutshell, you have better things to do. We know that this is true at least during the years that a student is at school from a small body of research that's growing. So we've got 2 studies in the US and then 1 in Denmark. Today, we're going to see whether this is true for students educated in the early 2010s in New South Wales. Specifically, we have 2 research questions that we're interested in. The first is, are kids with delayed school entry less likely to commit crime? And the second is, why is this the case? So, for the remainder of the presentation, we're going to go like this. I'll explain how school entry and exit laws work in New South Wales. I'll then describe the data that we're going to use. I'll describe the empirical approach, the model we pass the data through. After you put data in a model, you get results, so I'll outline those, and then we'll summarize. If you get lost or you zone out, it's okay. There are plenty of recaps, so don't panic. So, in New South Wales, a student enters their first year of school, which we call kindergarten, in the calendar year that they turn 5, which means they have no delayed school entry, or the year that they turn 6, which means they have delayed school entry. Whether a student enters in the year that they turn 5 or 6 depends partly on when in the year that they're born. If you're born between January and July, which I'm just going to call the first half of the year, even though it's more than a half, but it's just easier to say, your parents get to choose whether you enter school in the year that you turn 5 or the year that you turn 6. So everybody, the cohort of people born in the first half of the year, there's going to be a mix of people with delayed school entry and people without delayed school entry because your parents get to choose. If you're born in the second half of the year, your parents are required to have you enroll in the year that you turn 6. So everybody born in the second half of the year has delayed school entry. After that, you go through grades 1 through 12 sequentially. So if we have a look at, that's good. If we have a look at the table here, This is a set of birth cohorts. Each row is a birth cohort. We'll start up here in the green row. So what can we see? This birth cohort is people born between 1 August 1993 and 31 December 93. So that's second half of 1993. Because they're born in the second half of the year, everybody has delayed school entry, which means they started kindergarten when they turned 6 and they hit year 9 when they turned 15. In the yellow row, we've now got another birth cohort. So this is the first half of 94. You're born between January and July 94. Because you're born in that first half of the year, your parents get to choose. So there's going to be a mix of people with delayed school entry and without delayed school entry. If you have no delayed school entry, you hit kindergarten at age 5 and you turn 14 in year 9. If you had delayed school entry, you hit kindergarten when you're 6 and you get to grade 9 when you're 15. This pattern then repeats itself throughout the table. Why am I going to the care to show you how this works? Well, this is our estimation sample. People born in New South Wales between 1 August 93 and 31 December 96. They're the people we're interested in. All right, so our first recap. In New South Wales, students commence school in the year that they turn 5, which means no delayed school entry, or the year that they turn 6, which means delayed school entry. Whether you have delayed school entry partly depends on when in the year that you're born. As a result, there's always this relative age gap between students in the same grade. Some are older than others. What we care about is whether this relative age gap has an impact on crime. In other words, whether older students are less likely to commit crime. We might expect older students to commit less crime because they're more mature, which could lead to higher levels of human capital, so a higher opportunity cost of crime. Now let's talk through the data sets that we use. So we start here with the estimation sample we're going to be working with, which kind of defines everything. We construct the estimation sample from 2 data sets. The first is an extract from the New South Wales Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages. What they've given us is a list of people born between 1 August 93 and 31 December 96. So the birth cohorts on the table I showed you before. We then restrict that to people that didn't die in New South Wales before age 25. Why? Because we're going to track their crime up until they turn 25. We then use an extract from the NAPLAN data. So if you don't know, NAPLAN is like a standardized test students in a certain grade do every year. To be in our data set, you have to have sat the grade 9 NAPLAN assessment in New South Wales, survived to age 25, and been born between these dates. If you meet all of those conditions, you're in the data, and there's about 250,000 people. So they're the people we're talking about. Now, we've got this estimation sample, we need to split it into groups, treatment and control groups. How do we do that? We do that based on the NAPLAN data. Rather, we do it on a student's age in grade 9. Now, I know you might be thinking, all right, Steve, you said it all starts in kindergarten, why are you going to grade 9? I can't see anything that happens in kindergarten. Grade 9 is the earliest we can observe them in the data, so we start there. If you turn 15 in grade 9, we say that you have delayed school entry, so you're in the treatment group. If you turn 14 in grade 9, no delayed school entry, so you're in the control group. Of course, this doesn't take into account that people might repeat on the way up to grade 9. There's not really anything I can do about that. So we've got our estimation sample, we've split them into the treatment and control groups. Now let's have a look at the variables that we use in the study. So we start with some control variables up here. First set of controls comes from the NAPLAN data. Here we've got whether you're enrolled in a private school in year 9, and we've got a measure of socioeconomic status based on where you lived in year 9. From the Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages data, we've got your sex and Indigenous status. They're the control variables we're going to use. Now, in terms of the outcome variables, the stuff that we're actually interested in, we've got offending before age 25, and this comes from Boxar's ROD database. We've also got some stuff from the NAPLAN data, and we've got your reading and numeracy bands on the grade 9 assessment. Our main game is to look at the crime outcomes, but when we see changes in the crime outcomes, we want to think about and explain why they're happening. That's where the NAPLAN data comes in. So if we see a change in crime, we say, okay, this kid got better test scores on the way up, maybe he's got superior human capital. We've also got data on educational attainment, and here we can see whether you finished grade 10, 11, or 12. So they're the outcomes we're interested in, and that's like a sort of overview of the data that we're going to use. So, how should we use the data? Good question to ask right up front is, why not just compare outcomes between kids with delayed school entry and kids without delayed school entry? One reason is that it's been known for some time that delayed school entry results in better academic performance. So some people call this academic redshirting, but a lot of people haven't heard of the term. The idea is this. Parents that can afford, because you have to pay for childcare costs if you hold your kid back, parents that can afford to choose to delay their child's entry into school might provide better learning environments, have more financial resources, etc., etc. So if we just straight up compare the two groups, we'll just be comparing, or we could just be comparing high socioeconomic status kids with low socioeconomic status kids. This would cause us to overestimate the benefit of delayed school entry. So there's this bias. On the other hand, I think everybody knows that boys tend to be less mature than girls, particularly when they're young. So perhaps boys are more likely to have delayed school entry than girls. Boys are also more likely to commit crime. So if we just compare delayed school entry kids with no delayed school entry kids, what we really might be doing is just comparing boys with girls. Boys are more likely to commit crime, so this might cause us to underestimate the benefit of delayed school entry. So we kind of have these two competing effects. Let's have a look and see if that's reflected in the data that we're using. All right, so here we've got the variables that we use in the analysis. This column here is for the no delayed school entry group, and we're just reporting the averages. So this is the control group. This is the same for the treatment group or the kids with delayed school entry. Again, we're just reporting the means, and this is the difference between those means. What I want you to do is have a look at what I've circled in the yellow box to start with, and more specifically, let's have a look at this row highlighted in red. What does this say? It says that 44.8% of people in the no delayed school entry group are male. This one here says that 53.4% of people in the delayed school entry group are male, for a difference of 8.6 percentage points. Said differently, you're more likely to have delayed school entry if you're a guy. We know that guys commit more crime, which might be why we can see that if you have delayed school entry, you're more likely to have been convicted of any crime by the age of 25, and also more likely to be convicted of a property crime by age 25. So it looks like this kind of boys versus girls argument holds up. At the same time, in the green row, we can see that if you have delayed school entry, you're 2.5 percentage points more likely to be in a private school. You've also got a slightly higher CFA decile. In other words, both arguments hold. If you have delayed school entry, you're more likely to come from a wealthy background. If you have delayed school entry, you're more likely to be a guy. So these two competing forces are pushing against each other. How do we solve it? What we need to solve it is variation in the probability of delayed school entry that's otherwise unrelated to crime. So it's that kind of variation that the keynote was talking about earlier. One thing we can consider is a child's month of birth and whether that provides such variation. So let's think about this. When compared to the parents of children born in July, the parents of children born in January face an additional 6 months of childcare costs if they delay entry into kindergarten. Why is that? Because you're born earlier in the year, so your parents have to pay that extra amount of childcare costs. Once you go into school, they don't need to pay for childcare anymore. In other words, the earlier in the year that a child is born, the more money parents are looking at in terms of childcare costs if they choose delayed school entry, so the less likely they are to delay their child's entry into school. So we can have a look at some data now and see whether this idea is also supported. So what we have here on the horizontal axis is when a child is born in the year. The vertical line here is 1 August 1995. So remember, if you're born after August, or on or after 1 August, you have delayed school entry before your parents get to choose. On the vertical axis, we have the probability of delayed school entry. So there are 3 things to note here. The first thing is, if you're born after 1 August, 100% chance you have delayed school entry. That's always nice, because sometimes the data doesn't do what it's supposed to. So that's good. Second thing worth noting, the red dots are for the girls, the blue dots are for the guys. And we can see that for any date of birth, boys have a higher probability of delayed school entry, just like we saw in the previous table. The third thing, the most important thing that we want to look at here, is that as you're born later in the year, the probability of delayed school entry goes up. Okay, so a student's month of birth is clearly related to their delayed school entry status. Why is that helpful? It's helpful because it enables us to use an approach called instrumental variables. What it does is it allows us to identify the delayed school entry effect by exploiting variation in the probability of delayed school entry that's as good as random. In this case, that means unrelated to socioeconomic status or sex. We do this using a third variable called an instrument. The instrument we're going to consider is a student's month of birth. If an individual's month of birth impacts whether they have delayed school entry and has no other effect on their offending behavior, then enables us to isolate our comparison to the subset of students whose delayed school entry is influenced by their month of birth. So a picture here is usually pretty helpful. This is what we're after, the causal effect of delayed school entry on crime. This is the problem. We've got sex and socioeconomic status that at least partially determines crime and is also correlated with delayed school entry. IV provides the solution by giving us month of birth, or the instrument, which impacts delayed school entry, but it doesn't have an impact on crime. That's kind of that's the intuition behind it, how it works. So we trace the effect of month of birth on delayed school entry. We can then subset the analysis in some sense to children whose delayed school entry status is sensitive to their month of birth, and that lets us get the causal effect we're after. So that's the general idea. Let's have a look at some results. All right, so here we've grouped things by the full estimation sample, so that's everyone, males and females. And on the vertical axis, we have the probability of at least one crime before you turn 25. So overall, we can see there's a little reduction. The reduction is a bit bigger for guys and a little bit smaller for girls. All of the effects are statistically significant. In absolute terms, for everyone, we're looking at a drop from 15.7% down to 14.5%. So if you have no delayed school entry, the probability of you committing a crime by age 25 is 15.7. If you have delayed school entry, the probability is 14.5 for a difference of 1.2 percentage points. We can see the effect is a bit bigger for guys and a bit smaller for girls, but nothing major. All right, recap. So far, we can see that delayed school entry reduces crime. The next question is how this reduction is coming about. Let's think about two explanations. The first is incapacitation. That's the crime reduction that comes about because kids are in school instead of on the street. To look at incapacitation, we can examine the share of the total reduction in crime that occurs during the ages that a student is at school. So if most of the reduction is driven by, say, 10 to 17 when a kid's at school, we can say that it's mostly incapacitation. If most of the reduction comes about after they finish school, so 18 to 24, then we can say it's something else. That something else could be different preferences, so education can kind of like fundamentally change your preferences, make you more risk averse, or it could be increases in human capital, so you have better things to do with your time. That's the reduction in crime that comes about because students are more engaged in school and have high human capital as a result. To look at this explanation, we can look at the effect of delayed school entry on test scores and educational attainment. So let's do that. All right, so this is like the mirror universe version of the diagram I just showed you. Now, on the vertical axis, we're looking at the effect, the delayed school entry effect, the reduction in crime that occurs by age 25 expressed in percentage points. That's why it goes down, because crime's going down. Here we've got it for everyone, males and females. The black bars is crime that happens between the ages of 10 and 17. The purple bars is crime that happens as an adult after you leave school. So, what can we see? The first thing is that there's a reduction in both. So when you're aged between 10 to 17 or 18 to 24, In either case, crime's going down. For everyone, this is also true for males, and it's also true for the girls. So what's the general idea? Crime, there's both effects are happening. It's incapacitation and what happens after school. But what happens after school is driving most of the reduction, or at least more than 50%. If crime after school is driving most of the reduction, what we should expect to see is increases in test scores and educational attainment. Okie dokie. So what we have here is two panels. The first is for the guys, the second is for the girls, and then we've got the probability of finishing grade 10, 11, and 12 for both. So this is educational attainment. This is for kids with delayed school entry in the purple. The black is no delayed school entry. So what can we see? For guys, there's a small increase, all of them are statistically significant, on the probability of finishing grade 10, 11, and 12. We can also see small increases for the girls. So, the pattern for test scores is largely the same. There's increases for delayed school entry, but nothing major, nothing huge. It's not the panacea of solving crime. All right, so this is it, last slide. Let's go through a bit of a recap. In terms of the results, delayed school entry lowers the probability of a conviction by age 25. The effect is stronger for boys than it is for girls. A good chunk of the reduction occurs during both a student's time in school, when they're 10 to 17, and after they leave school, when they're 18 to 24. We can also see improvements in test scores and educational attainment. So if you're a parent and you have a boy, it's probably a good idea to do delayed school entry if you can. If you have a girl, it probably doesn't matter as much from a crime standpoint, but probably still a good idea because they're more likely to finish school and they're going to get better test scores. Again, if it's too late and you've already decided to not delay school entry, or perhaps you weren't delayed school entry yourself, it's okay because the effects aren't huge. They'll just never achieve their full potential. From a crime reduction standpoint, having all students enroll in school in the year they turn 6 might be a good idea. I think they do this in New Zealand. So basically waiting till kids are more mature might be a good idea. And one thing I'll say is that the delayed school entry effect is bigger than the effect of raising the minimum school leaving age from 15 to 17 in terms of both education and crime outcomes. That's it. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Steve. I've seen that now twice in a week, just as engaging the second time around. Do we have questions? I can already see a question in the audience, so we'll start at the back here and then move on.
Hi. Thank you. That was a great presentation, and I liked your use of the instrumental variable, date of birth, in order to control for something that I'm going to touch at. And this is probably something you've already heard before, so I'll apologize in advance. But it's interesting because the terminology uses delayed school entry. But to me, the term delayed means that someone made an explicit decision to delay this individual because of a maturity issue or some type of personality issue, as opposed to later school entry. So your comparison of non-delayed and delayed, I would call earlier versus later entry. And that relates to this question. Could there be a subgroup of individuals within what you call delayed school entry that where a guardian or parent made an explicit decision to hold them back because they were lacking maturity, there's something in their personality that they felt needed to be held back, and in which case, maybe your instrumental variable might not capture some critical variance that would be explained by that subgroup of individuals in your... So the question is really, is there a subgroup of individuals that parents make a decision about that might be a little bit different than somebody that was just delayed because of date of birth?
Yeah, so on the first point about naming it, yeah, I agree. It was hard because I originally was calling it the relative age effect, which I thought was more precise, but it's harder to say, and it's easy to get tripped up. In terms of the subgroup, yes, that's definitely possible. I think it comes down to different effects for different parts of the estimation sample. The extent to which I can look at it using the data I have, I think is limited based on what I've got, unfortunately. But it's definitely a good point.
Thank you. I saw one more question at the front here as well.
Thank you. Georgina Spilsbury from Corrective Services. I really enjoyed your talk. I love data. But one thing that follows on from the other question was that when you're talking about the later school entry, from your data set, not only, particularly when you're comparing the January and July group, you're not only comparing the birth date, you're comparing the season of birth. And we know that in large samples, there can be differences in the presentation of psychiatric and other conditions based on the season that someone is born. For example, the mother may not have had enough vitamin D, etc., etc. So that's something that I guess you'd also maybe need to think about in your data set.
So I did give it a bit of a look. What you can do is you can look at the relationship between month of birth and then everything that you can see in the data that it isn't offending. If that effect is there, it's not big enough to see in the data that I have. So I'm sure there is like a body of evidence that says that's there, but the effect isn't strong enough to be visible based on what I've got.
Thank you. We had one more question up here in blue on this side of the room. I think all the questions are from this side of the room so far, so we'll keep it even.
Hi there. Dom D'Andraggi from Griffith Uni. That was a great presentation, thank you. I'm curious about your consideration of the Australian context with school readiness, and that a lot of parents particularly in the last 10 years, hold their children back from going to school if they can, because they're not scoring highly on the school readiness test, they're not scoring highly on literacy and numeracy tests or socially or emotionally aren't ready to go into school. And perhaps that could be a possible explanation for what we're seeing later down the track with that group.
Yeah, definitely, I think. I had delayed school entry because when I was in preschool, the preschool lady said I wasn't mature enough to go to kindy. So had I not had delayed school entry, probably wasn't ready.
And you turned out to be a star, Steve. The one thing I was a bit surprised, I mean, your instrument's taking a terrible hammering and I'm not going to join the crowd, but the one thing I was surprised in the implications is you didn't suggest tax deductions for people who delay entry for their kids. They've got to pay all that extra childcare, but all they get by way of consolation is less crime.
You know, my girlfriend did say that to me last night when I was doing practice run. I probably should have added it in.
Thank you so much, Steve. We might leave it there.